This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Today we're discussing how the U.S. government meddles with our mouths. The Department of Agriculture subsidizes the growing of some crops, pays farmers not to farm others, interferes with how farmers choose what to grow and where to grow it, and a host of other ways too. Then, on the demand side, officials demand fat taxes, calorie counts on menus, and artificially stimulates the demand for organic or locally grown products. None of this is part of a free market. My guest today will explore the consequences of these interventions and more. My first guest is Dr. Darren Hudson. Dr. Hudson is the professor and Larry Combest Agricultural Competitiveness Endowed Chair in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics here at Texas Tech University, and the author of the book, Agricultural Markets and Prices. Darren, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start off with just getting a feel for the scope of this on the farm production side of things. You know, anybody who's been to Washington, D.C. and driven down Independence Ave has seen this Department of Agriculture that just goes on and on. I think the joke is if you see a bureaucrat crying in there, it's because his farmer died. There's so many of them. So what do all these bureaucrats do? How do they interfere with agricultural markets, for good or bad, here in the United States?
Well, I mean, I think from a historical context, you have to realize that like lots of government programs we think of today, farm programs started in the Great Depression, and they've perpetuated themselves over long periods of time. At one time, USDA was the largest single employer outside the Department of Defense. I think Veterans Affairs now is one of the largest. But that bureaucracy is there to handle a whole host of things. Not just farm programs, because USDA handles nutrition programs, those sorts of things, which actually consume most of the budget. But historically, USDA interfered pretty dramatically and directly with farms, managing things like acres and prices and, all the decisions that farmers made on a daily basis. It's evolved through time.
So this is going back to the 1930s
yes.
until...
Probably up until the 80s.
Okay.
In the 80s, we started a transition to a little more market-based types of things, counter-cyclical payments. In the 90s, we introduced crop insurance. And now we have transitioned most of what we think of as farm programs into crop insurance, which is subsidized. Those components are subsidized. But it's very different in the world because farmers now can respond to market forces in terms of what prices are out there, what determines the most profitable crops for them to grow. But they're still tethered to farm programs in a significant way that does shape the decisions they make, but less directed.
Yeah, so let's stick with the crop insurance for just a second, right? So I hear about, subsidized house insurance when people build on the coast, and this tells me people are building houses in California where they're going to fall into the water and shouldn't be there, or in Florida where they're going to get flooded. Doesn't this mean farmers are doing the same thing with some of their crops?
To some extent, when you subsidize any insurance product that's not actuarially fair, obviously what you're doing is you're inducing behavior that wouldn't exist in a normal free market. Sort of the political argument that's been made over time is that the agricultural infrastructure and the output from that agricultural process, the food and fiber that we rely on, is a national interest. And so, if we subsidize it, we can protect people from a lot of downside risk, and it keeps people in business. That's questionable how true that is. Certainly the insurance products are very expensive. So if you were to go, it's not like buying your house insurance. You're talking about farmers typically $60,000, $70,000, $100,000 for just the insurance part of what they're covering.
I don't know. I'm not too worried about people going hungry in the United States. I'm going to talk about with the second guest, people being too fat supposedly from the government. Where's a good famine when you need one?
Yeah, right.
So what's the effect of the type of policies then? Does it make food cheaper, more expensive? Does it depend on what type of food?
I think it depends on what type of food. So historically, we've subsidized grains, cotton, soybeans, corn, rice, things like that. We've not subsidized directly fruits and vegetables. I think if we step back and we look at some of the research that's been done on this topic, the direct subsidies to farmers have tended to have very little impact on food prices. What's really driven food prices down in a relative sense over time has been investments in research and development. So the federally subsidized experiment station system, land grant college system, has had a significant impact on food prices.
And of course, just technology and growth in general is the main driver.
Well, and you can make a strong argument because of the subsidization of agriculture. We've increased the economies of scale, and the economies of scale have been matched by this growth in technology. It's allowed us to have bigger farms because we have bigger plows and we have chemicals and all these sorts of things. So those things are so intertwined, it's hard to pick them apart. Certainly, we know that it's had some impact. So consumers do receive some benefit, but on the flip side, they're all taxpayers too. And those programs don't come for free. And they do have a cost to the U.S. taxpayer.
So, I think an interesting thing that you just mentioned there is, so the farmers are subsidized, but a lot of it doesn't change their behavior. Is that because a lot of it's just payments to them that aren't tied to their production decisions?
Of late, that's been a big part of the issue. I think if we look at it sort of empirically, perhaps the technological effects have overwhelmed the subsidy effects. That it just makes it so big. And then we have payment limits, so farms can only get so much. And when you're talking about a 5,000 acre corn farm in Iowa, the $50,000 they might get out of the farm program direct payments are inconsequential to the size of the farm. So the economies of scale have simply just sort of swamped that of late. Early on, obviously in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, the farm programs had a huge impact on decision making, and it has shaped to some extent the way our farming system has evolved. Some critics would argue that because we're more monoculture oriented was because of farm programs.
So as it's evolved over time, then it almost seems like we might become more market orientated for economic growth reasons, but also policy changes then.
Yeah, I think one of the major pushes politically has been to push us back in the direction of more market orientation. We're not there yet. I mean, we're certainly not in a completely free market by any means.
So actually, relative comparison, and I know you're not necessarily an expert in this industry, but as I'm thinking about the shift since 2008, what's more of a market-driven versus government-driven industry in terms of financial services under their new regulations versus farms?
Farms are definitely more market-oriented. The financial services sector has become increasingly regulated. Farming's regulated for sure, EPA, other people have an influence. But in terms of the scope of the magnitude of the decision making, certainly Frank Dodd and some of the other kinds of policies that have been implemented in financial services are heavily influencing those decisions.
So if we were going to redesign or tweak farm policy and you were in charge, you're head of the Department of Agriculture, and you can actually get Congress to do what you want.
King for a day.
King for a day. Actually, since you're going to be a planner here, I'm going to make you czar for the day.
Okay, there you go.
What tweaks would you make to the system?
Well, I mean, I think the path that we've been on is a good one, moving more towards market-oriented policies and eventually withdrawing other than sort of the basic bottom line safety net. So, like in cotton, it's 52 cents a pound. If it drops below that level, we don't like it from a strategic standpoint. But other than that, we really don't want to mess with markets too much. I think there are a number of regulatory issues and things that I would change for sure in moving decisions back to individuals as opposed to at USDA or even at the state level. But certainly we need to move in a situation. Unilateral disarmament, never really works. The rest of the world subsidizes agriculture pretty heavily.
Isn't that great? Let them subsidize it. Send me
it
free
to us.
cows.
Send us the cheap stuff. Yeah, and to some extent that's true. But politically that's hard to swallow. But certainly I think movement in the direction of market orientation is a much better, more efficient way to handle this system.
All right. Well, Darren, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Evan.
Buy local, buy organic, because it's good for the planet? My next guest says that's a bunch of bunkum. We'll be right back.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Jason Lusk. Dr. Lusk is a Regents Professor and Willard Sparks Endowed Chair in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Oklahoma State University. He's the author of 4 books, including, most recently, The Food Police, a well-fed manifesto about the politics of your plate. You also might be interested to know that he's a Red Raider who earned his undergraduate degree right here at Texas Tech. Jason, welcome to the show and back to Texas Tech.
Hi, Ben. Thanks. It's good to be back on campus.
So you've written this provocative book on the food police, which I love the title. And there's a few topics in there I want to cover with you that aren't just foreign policy, but more about how the government tries to meddle with our choices and stuff, and that I think the public has a lot of misconceptions about. So let's start with something scary. GMOs, or Frankenfood, I think is you refer to it as the book. Should we be, what is this, and should we be scared of it?
So what is it? It's a sort of advance in modern agricultural technology and breeding. And typically what it involves is inserting new genes into seeds to have them have new traits that they never had before. The 2 most common varieties are pesticide resistance or herbicide resistant corn, soybeans. The advantages of those are it allows, in the case of pesticide resistance, it allows you to grow corn without having to also spray pesticides. So it's a pretty darn good environmental benefit.
Doesn't sound scary to me. It sounds like my corn's going to have less spray on it.
Exactly. When I was a kid growing up here in West Texas, I had to hoe cotton weeds for a lot of my childhood, and in large part, that job is obsolete, and I'm kind of happy for it. And one of the reasons is now we can spray herbicide on that cotton, and it kills the weeds, but doesn't kill the cotton. So those are just a couple of examples. There are a lot of, I think, some of the more interesting examples of those things coming in the future, improving nutrition. One of the most interesting ones that just came on the market are apples that don't brown. So there are a lot of really interesting things that's happening. People are worried about this a little bit. And so I think whenever you're worried, what you want to try to do is look at what the best research has to say on this subject. And you can turn to virtually any of our major scientific authorities on the subject, whether it's our National Academy of Sciences, whether it's the World Health Organization, the American Medical Association, or many, many others. And all these that have looked at the research have found that none of these technologies are any riskier than any of the other kinds of plant breeding technologies that we've been using over the years.
You just said plant breeding technologies. Isn't that genetically modifying, but just in a kind of sloppy way?
Well, that's exactly right. In a lot of ways, the new biotechnologies are much more precise than our traditional plant breeding. With traditional plant breeding, you're taking a mom and a dad, so to speak, and you don't really know what's going to happen. A lot of random things are going to happen. Whereas with our modern biotechnology, typically we're introducing one new trait into a gene sequence that we already have a really good idea of how it happens. So in a lot of ways, it's much more precise than the sort of older technologies that we've been using.
Right. I mean, not plants, but everybody has experience with genetically modified animals. If you've petted a nice, cute puppy, right? Nature didn't give us dogs. Humans crossbred them for generations to get all these different types. And you see what happens when 2 of them mix. If you get a golden retriever and a chihuahua, you're going to get quite the mix there. I'd much rather just take the one thing you want to move than splicing it all, wouldn't you?
Exactly. There is this sort of idea that I want food the way God gave it to me. But if you look back at nature, you know, our ancestor of modern corn was no bigger than your thumb. And the reason we have the kind of abundant food supply we have now is because our ancestors picked those varieties that were a little tastier, a little more productivity, had a little more productivity to them. And they created the animals and plants that we have around us now. These were not the same plants and animals we had 10,000 years ago because we humans have been manipulating our environment, and I would say for the good.
Yeah, our history involves a lot of starvation before now. So let's move instead of to maybe manipulating to the good for manipulating for the at least questionable. I've been told all the time, buy organic. Organic is better for you. It's better for the environment. Is this true?
There's absolutely nothing wrong with buying organic. And if you want to buy organic, I say go for it. But buying organic is also more expensive. So typically you'll see when you go in the grocery store, 50, 60, 70% premiums for organic. So the question is, what bang am I getting for my buck? Is it worth it? And I think a lot of the fears people have about food and the reason they buy organic is they're fearful of pesticides or growth promotants. But if you look at the actual scientific research, these are things that people have very little reason to be concerned about. And so at least for me, when I make those kind of trade-offs, it's just not worth the 50, 60, 70% price premium to do that. Moreover, when you look at, say, environmental impacts, organics typically require much more land to grow the same amount of food. So as a consequence, it's not all that clear that organics are better for the environment or not. So I'm not going to necessarily try to discourage anyone from buying organic, but what I will say is just try to make an informed decision based on the best available research.
And I think importantly too, well, I won't dispute people's preferences. If they want to do what I think is weird stuff, go for it. But as a matter of policy, if the government starts actively promoting organic at the expense of other things, I mean, this is bad for poor people who are trying to feed their families, isn't it?
I think this sort of paternalism is a big problem, and it's a problem I think that's sort of growing with regard to food, that I think everyone should be eating like me. And often this comes from folks who are sort of upper middle class foodies, if you will. And again, I think it's great if you want to eat certain kinds of food that are more expensive, but to realize there are other people in society that have entirely different preferences than you, I think is a real problem. And we don't want to pass policies to impose our particular food preferences on other people that may not care about the same things we do.
Or be able to afford the same things we do. If we had a national Ferrari promotion policy, that doesn't mean poor people would suddenly have them.
That's right. That's a good example because people will say, well, isn't organic food higher quality, better tasting? Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. But isn't a Ferrari much more enjoyable to drive? But that doesn't mean it would be good government policy to subsidize everyone's purchase of a Ferrari.
Right, absolutely. Now, another one of these that actually riles me up more than organic. Buy local. Now, this just, to an economist, it just strikes me as inherently anti-division of labor, that we're wealthy because we trade with people all around the globe, and we're going to move back to buy local, even if not as a matter of policy, but as a matter of preference. What gives here?
Yeah, so what I like to tell people is I'm not against local food, but I am against bad arguments for buying local food. And so a lot of what people say about buying local food just doesn't hold much water. One example would be buying local food's good for the environment. Well, that is a misunderstanding, I think, of the environmental impacts of food production. Most of the environmental impacts of food production occur where the food is grown, and very little of that is due to transportation. So if you think you're saving the environment by having the food transported fewer miles, it doesn't really reflect the reality of our food production system. What it tells me is that what I want to do is grow our food where it can be most efficiently grown, because that's going to have the fewest environmental impacts, and then transport it to me as the food consumer. When we put things on boats and semis, those are really pretty darn efficient ways of getting food to us. Actually, if you look at the research, us driving to the supermarket in terms of transportation often has a bigger environmental impact.
Or us driving to the special local market one as opposed to the big box one that's right near us.
Right.
Actually, I've even seen, I think you mentioned it in one of your studies, that it's less environmental impact in England to consume lamb from New Zealand?
That's exactly right. And so you think, oh, isn't that kind of crazy? How is it possible that transporting lamb over 10,000 miles rather than, say, 10 miles can be more environmentally friendly? And the reason is because Australia and New Zealand are naturally endowed with all those things that make growing lamb easy. Not lots of sunshine, lots of grass, lots of land. And once you have that lamb, you can put it on a boat. Shipping by boat is incredibly energy efficient. You know, Columbus was sailing the ocean blue before we had fossil fuels. So putting something on a boat is an incredibly energy efficient way to transport things. And so again, I think the things that sometimes feel intuitively right to us, that it must be environmentally friendly because it's closer, when you look at the actual research and the data and you think about the trade-offs you're making, it just doesn't hold up.
Sure. I mean, I think we could make it intuitive, right? It's clear that we should grow oranges in Florida and send them to Alaska instead of make oranges in Alaska, but we could.
Yes.
But doesn't this cut to actually some of what the buy local people really want is for us to change our diet?
Yeah, I had this argument with got into a discussion with someone once. I had a title of an article that says, that made the comment that you shouldn't eat pineapples in North Dakota, or you shouldn't grow pineapples in North Dakota. And the gentleman said, well, my argument isn't that. My argument is people in North Dakota shouldn't eat pineapples. So really, you're right. The idea is that somehow we want people to want different things. But the way I look at it is, it's a wonder of our marketplace that you can walk into McDonald's or United or any of our grocery stores in the middle of December and buy jalapenos and tomatoes and onions and cilantro, All those things we can get because the market provides it to us, because there are places in California or Florida or Mexico that are willing to grow those and transport it up to us. And indeed, people like to say, well, eating local is better for the nutrition and better for your health. But the reality is that diversity of food that we have available to us is because we trade with other people who have different climates than we do.
Yeah, I agree that it's completely a marvel, and it's one that even 30 years ago, you didn't see as much in the stores. So let's transition to our last topic then, about being better for us. So the new thing has become to put calorie counts on menus in restaurants by government edict, to put fat taxes on junk food. What's the science behind this, or is this just the planners imposing their will?
Right. Well, I think if you look at the research, what it shows is a lot of the fat taxes that people have proposed really just aren't going to have much effect at all. So it's, I think, a lot of sort of feel-good policymaking that ultimately will have very trivial effects on our weight.
By having no effect, you mean the people are still going to buy it anyway and still become just as hefty, but the government's going to have stolen some of their money in the process? That's
exactly right. So take, for example, a soda tax. One of the things, if it's not well designed, is people might just substitute towards, say, fruit juices. Or one study out of Cornell showed you might substitute towards alcoholic beverages. Those have just as many, if not more, calories than sodas. So people are having to choose an alternative they wouldn't have otherwise, which means that it's sort of making them worse off. Or they buy the thing they wanted to in the beginning, the Dr. Pepper, for example, that now just costs them more. And so you're changing people's preferences, taking money out of their back pockets to really without creating any countervailing benefit.
Now, if they wanted to do this, why wouldn't the government just tax fat people instead of fatty foods?
Yeah, because when you frame it that way, that sounds really mean, doesn't it?
It does, but it seems mean to me either way.
It does, and I think it's useful to frame it that way, because I think the sort of economist way would say, if why do we want these policies to begin with? If you want to eat a hamburger or drink a Coke, what does that have to do with me?
Right.
And so typically when economists thinks about interfering in market outcomes, we want to have some good reason to do it, like there's an externality or something like that. You're imposing costs on me. But I think the challenge is that those sorts of arguments also don't hold up very well. And we ought to respect the choices people make given their own preferences and their own incomes.
I'm all for respecting the choices that people make and getting these bumbling bureaucrats out of our way on this. Thanks for writing this book and for joining us here today, Jayson.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, on today's show, we first learned about how, while the government meddles in agriculture, the trend has been for less meddling over time and more market forces, and I think that's a good thing. Unfortunately, on the second half of the show, we talked about how people have what seem to be irrational fears about GMOs and how we overestimate the benefits to organic or local production, and how the government wants to stick fat taxes on products that a lot of us enjoy consuming. Personally, I wish America's busybodies, nannies, and petty tyrants would leave us alone when we're making decisions of how to fill our stomachs. See you next time.